less than a week away from the anniversary of our Lord's death, which occurred at Passover. We're going to celebrate Passover. We're going to remember the redemption that the Father provided for our ancestors many years ago when He delivered them out of Egypt. We're also going to remember that all of that was a foreshadow of the redemption that the Father was going to provide for us through His only Son by sending Him to die on the tree at the appointed time of Passover to deliver us from our sins so that we could have relationship with Him and fellowship, forgiveness of sins, so we can walk in all of the fullness of the Almighty who lives in us by His Spirit. Hallelujah. Praise His holy name. Today our topic, as we prepare for next Friday evening. Next Friday evening we're going to meet here at 6. The doors will be open at 5 so that you can come in early and we can get started promptly at 6. We're going to have a 3-course meal. Woo-hoo. That'll be fun. That'll be good. And we're going to retell the story of the redemptions. Both of them. The Egyptian redemption and the redemption brought by our Master, Messiah, Yahushua. Hallelujah. So today, we're going to look at a topic I've entitled The Passover Then and Now. A survey of the Passovers and the instructions given for the Passover. So we want to kind of know what's coming next Friday evening when we begin to do these things that are a little bit different. And because we're going to remember what Father did for us. So the summary of the appointed times is as follows. The Father has given us in Miqra or Leviticus 23 a listing of appointed times. These set times that Father has placed on His calendar, the biblical calendar. Times when He is going to perform, has performed and will perform the acts of redemption for His people. And all of these appointed times look back in the past. It's something that He already did for His ancient people. And they look also back, not quite as far, to the work of Messiah on the tree to instigate the redemption and the deliverance from sin and the restoration of all things. And it also looks into the future when those things will be fulfilled, when Messiah returns a second time to fulfill all the things that didn't get accomplished the first time. He's going to come not as a meek and lowly servant this time as He did last time, but He's going to return as a powerful king. And we're going to have to, the world is going to have to obey or die. I mean that's just putting it honestly and simply. He's going to come and He's going to be the king. And there's not going to be another way. It's going to be His way or the highway, as they say. So the Pesach is the first of the appointed times. And it pictures the deliverance by lamb's blood. And that is immediately followed with, and actually connected to, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the pilgrimage feast of unleavened bread, wherein we're commanded to eat unleavened bread during those 7 days. As a remembrance of the fact that our ancestors ate unleavened bread when they came out of Egypt because they didn't have time for the dough to rise. They didn't have time to leaven the bread. So they took off with their baskets full of unleavened bread, and they journeyed for so many days, and they ate unleavened bread for 7 days. Later on, about 7 weeks later, comes Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks, also called Pentecost. And this is when the Father delivered His Torah, His law, His instructions for life to His people. And this also pictures and foreshadows the time when the Father would send His Holy Spirit. When Messiah would go back in heaven, as He said He needed to go up in heaven so that He can send His Spirit back to us, to indwell us, to empower us to do the things that Father desires for us to do. The Day of the Shout is something that happens in the 7th month on the Hebrew calendar. And it pictures, in the future, I believe, the shout that occurs at the time when Messiah returns. And then there's the Day of the Atonements. These are judgments that take place in the earth. An atonement for sin, either forgiveness of sins because of the blood of the Messiah, or the punishment for sin for those who have not repented and obeyed. They will be atoned for by giving their own life, by dying the second death. And then tabernacles is a picture actually of past, present, and future, when the Messiah is dwelling with his people, tabernacling among us. So let's look at the Passover now. There were several different Passovers, although they're all kind of one and the same. There are differences in the Passovers that were celebrated. There was the first Passover, which occurred in Egypt, and it was something that individuals, families did in their own homes. They were commanded to put the blood of the lamb on their doorposts and the lintel of the door, and thus forming a picture of the Messiah hanging on the tree with the blood in his, with the spikes in his hands and the crown of thorns and his bleeding head. And so there was blood all around the doorpost. And inside any doorpost is what? What's inside a doorpost? A door, right? He said, I am the door. I am the way. I am the door. And so Messiah was indicating that he is what is being pictured by sprinkling the blood on the doorposts. He's the door that's between those doorposts. And he's the way in or out. He's the one that protects. He's the one that provides access or not. Protection from the enemy. In the second Passover, they didn't do it in individual homes. And we'll look at the commandment in a little while. The second Passover was different because they did this out in the wilderness from their tents. They brought their lamb, and they sacrificed it, and they ate that lamb, I believe, in their tents. There was no need to sprinkle blood on the doorposts of the tent. There was no doorpost on tents. But there was no more death angel that was going to come through and kill all the firstborn. So there was no need for the blood on the doorposts. And then after that, all of the Passovers were celebrated in the place where Yahweh put his name. In fact, this second Passover is the same thing, because what they had already established and built the tabernacle of the Father, and so he was in their midst, and they were celebrating in his presence, even during that second year after they came out of Egypt. And so every subsequent Passover was celebrated wherever the Father had put his name. It wasn't done in individual homes. So the people would come up according to the commandment for the 3 annual pilgrimage feasts, and they would present themselves to the Father. But the Passover, the individual families would bring their animal, they would slaughter it, and then they would take that animal back, I believe, and roast it. I'm not sure, it's not clear to me whether they roasted it on the altar there, or whether they took it back to their own homes and roasted it. But in any case, you know what, I take that back. Actually, what the scripture says is that they were to celebrate in the presence of Yahweh. And so everybody brought their lamb up with them to the tabernacle or the temple site, wherever that place was. They would roast and then eat that Passover lamb, and then they would stay there in the presence of the Father, celebrating and remembering by vigil how the Father had kept vigil on their behalf on that Passover night when he spared all of their firstborn sons. And so the pattern for all the rest of the Passovers was to stay in the presence, not go back home yet or not go back to your tent. But in the morning, they would go back to their tents because they kept vigil all night. And then the Passover after Messiah's death on the tree was different because now we're remembering that the Messiah is the one who fulfills all of these things that were written in the Torah. So the first Passover, this is the only one occurring in Egypt. The passing over was about the death angel passing over the houses with blood on the lintel and doorposts. So the Israelites were commanded to slaughter a blameless lamb. They were to choose a blameless lamb, one without spot or wrinkle, on the 10th day of the month of the Aviv. And on the 14th day, they were to slaughter that animal between the evenings. And then they were to sprinkle that blood on the lintel and doorposts of their houses. This Passover was different and unique from all the other Passovers. So instructions for the first Passover, and this is found in Exodus chapter 12 and verses 1 through 3. Yahweh said to Moshe and Aharon in Mitzrayim, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats." And so there is this underlying thought that if they're to take into account the number of people and what each person would eat, presumably the plan was to eat the whole lamb, or all the part of the lamb that could be eaten. And so they would take this lamb. Sometimes a family would join another family, a neighbor, if they didn't have very many people in their family, so that they would all share the lamb and eat the whole lamb. Because the instruction later was that nothing was to be left over until morning. If there was anything left over of the lamb, it was to be burned and not eaten. The animals were year-old males without defect. This is an interesting picture of the Messiah, who, according to a popular reckoning of his times in his ministry, really didn't serve and walk around with his disciples for 3.5 years, as is commonly taught, but actually his ministry only lasted for about a year, just a little bit over a year. If you go through the fourth gospel, the gospel also known as the Gospel of John, but whom we know Lazarus wrote, you'll see that as you look through the feasts that the Messiah went up to, they all are in order, beginning with the first Passover. After his temptation, the 40 days in the wilderness, he went up to that first Passover, and that's where he made the prediction about, if you tear down this temple, I'll raise it in 3 days. And people misunderstood, especially the leadership misunderstood. So he was there at that Passover. And then as you go through the rest of the fourth gospel, you'll see that they're all in order. Even though in chapter 6 of the fourth gospel, there's a misprint or a misinterpretation of what the Jewish feast was that they went up to. It was not another Passover. Isn't that what some versions say? That it was another Passover. It was not another Passover. That was a glitch, a scribal glitch. So my point here is that Messiah's ministry lasted just a little bit over a year. He resurrected on the following year at Passover after his death. And then of course in 40 days he went up to be with the Father. And so this picture of a year-old male without defect is a very clear picture of the Messiah, who was a year-old minister of the gospel, if you will. His ministry lasted a year, so he was a year-old male. From the time of his baptism to the time of his death and resurrection was just a little over a year. And he was without defect, he was without sin, which qualified him to be the spotless Lamb of Elohim who takes away the sin of the world. It says, you may take them from the sheep or the goats, because both sheep and goats are clean animals. And so it was permissible to take a year-old male from either the sheep or the goats. Further on, instructions for the first Passover, in verses 6 through 8 of Exodus chapter 12, take care of them, these lambs that you've selected, until the 14th day of the month, when all the people of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. And the expression there in the Hebrew is actually between the evenings, where it says twilight. And what I understand that to mean is the word for evening actually literally means a going down. It refers to the setting of the sun. But it can also refer to the going down of the sun from its height midday. So there begins a going down of the sun, an evening, if you will, if you want to translate it that way, a going down at around the noon hour or the midday, and then the sun settles beneath the horizon at sunset. And so those are the going downs. Those are the evenings that's being referred to here. So the lambs were to be slaughtered during the second half of the daylight hours of the 14th day of the first month. It says, then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. And so that first Passover, because the death was coming that night, the 10th plague, the destruction of the firstborn, the sons of Israel were permitted this opportunity to cover themselves by the blood of the Lamb. Very popular theme in Christian churches, wouldn't you say? Being covered by the blood of the Lamb. We have lots of songs about that. And so it comes from this Passover ceremony whereby the blood of the Lamb was what provided protection for the true followers and the obedient ones of Yahweh. Now, if the Israelites didn't do as Father instructed and just believed him, that he was going to deliver them, but they didn't put the blood on their doorposts, the death angel would have come, not seen the blood, and they would have slaughtered the firstborn in that household. So obedience is always a part of our walk with the Father. It's always a part of a demonstration of our true trust in him. We can trust him with our whole heart, and that's all good and well. And we should, and we must. But along with that trust from the heart comes trust in our actions. The action of obedience to what he's instructed us to do. And so there was an element that the sons of Israel participated in this redemption. It wasn't all the Father's work, although it was the Father's work, but they had to be, as we put it a couple weeks ago, in agreement with Yahweh. And when they were in agreement with Yahweh, they did what he said. They slaughtered the lamb on the 14th day. They put the blood on the lintel and doorpost of their house, and they were protected that night from the death angel. That same night, they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. And so the purpose of the bitter herbs, it's not clear why they were commanded to eat the bitter herbs. Aside from the fact that the bitter herbs, for us, seems to be a representation of the bitterness of the slavery from which they were being delivered. The bread made without yeast was because they didn't have time to put leaven in their dough to cause it to rise. And this was to be a memorial for the years, every year afterwards. And so they remembered this night by eating unleavened bread that night and for 7 days, because that was part of their experience and their journey along the road out of Egypt. The instructions continue in verses 9 through 11. It says, do not eat the meat raw or cooked in water, but roasted over the fire, head, legs, and inner parts. So in other words, this lamb was not to be cut up and carved up and then roasted, as we typically do with the meats that we roast, the meats that we enjoy. But the whole lamb was put on a spit and it was roasted over the fire. And I guess the best way to roast a lamb in that manner is to keep that spit turning, right? Keep that spit turning and it will continue to cook and cook and cook evenly, hopefully. And then that whole animal will be roasted and ready to be eaten. It says, do not leave any of it until morning. If some is left until morning, you must burn it. So this idea of roasting it over the fire, it's important because meat that is there were other instructions about how offerings were to be presented, and the offerings that were presented to the Father were always roasted over the fire. They weren't boiled or cooked that I can remember, any of those sacrifices. I mean, that was a typical way to cook meat, but when you present an offering to the Father, it's to be roasted over fire. That's the way that He requires it. So this is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste, it is Yahweh's Passover. So that night they were preparing, even though I don't think the reality of them leaving Egypt really set in, they were commanded to eat ready to walk, ready to march. Sandals on their feet, staff in the hand. Eat it in haste, and this word haste actually means trepidation. It wasn't necessary that you had to eat your meal really fast and get indigestion, but that because of the circumstances of that night, when they were hearing screams from their neighbors' houses around, who did not have blood on their doorposts, whose firstborn were dying, there was a great deal of fear and trepidation. And I think if they were trusting in the Father, I think that, because this had never occurred before. And so when they're hearing all these screams, it was natural to be fearful of what was going on around them, all the death of these firstborns in these other houses. And so they ate this Passover meat, this Passover meal, in trepidation, or haste as it puts it here. They were fearful of what was happening and what could happen to them, because Yahweh was fulfilling what He said He was going to do. And He said He was going to slaughter, He was going to slay all the firstborn of the sons of Egypt, and even of their animals, and of anyone who would not put the blood on their doorposts and so trust in the Father. Sandals on their feet. Now, sometimes when we do our Passovers, sometimes we dress up a little and we might have a staff and our sandals. But it's not because we really expect to be marching anywhere first thing in the morning. We're just remembering what they did back then. We're trying to put ourselves in their shoes and remember what our ancestors experienced when the Father delivered them out of Egypt. And so it can be kind of a fun thing, and it can be an insightful thing as we try to put ourselves in their place and experience the Passover as much as it is possible for us, the way that they experienced the Passover. On that same night, and now here's the promise, on that same night I will pass through Mitzrayim, Egypt, and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals. And I will bring judgment on all the gods of Mitzrayim. I am Yahweh. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Mitzrayim. So here, in a few verses later, it talks about this death angel that comes. But the Father is saying, I will pass through Mitzrayim. And so the Father was that one who is striking down. The Father is the one who judges. He's the one that when he sees the blood, which is the sign of an obedient people, then he's going to pass over that house, because redemption is going to be provided for that household who believe and trust in him. And again, this is all parallel to the redemption that we have in the Messiah. It's all about trusting in him and the work that he did. But it has to be something that we're actively involved in. It's not a passive faith that we're talking about here. It's an active obedience to the Father and a demonstration of what true trust brings about in our lives. So no destructive plague will touch you when I strike Mitzrayim. And I liked the reading by Matt today from Psalm 91, because that speaks of the same protection that the Father provides for his people. That 1,000 will fall at your right hand, 10,000 before you, but no destructive plague will come near you. And that's what the Father promises those who love him and obey him, that we're going to be protected. So this is a day, let me go back here real quick. It says on that same night. And this is really important, because this really lays out the order of events for the Passover. Because there are different points of view. I know that there are different groups that observe the Passover at the beginning part of the 14th day of the month. Remember that days, biblically speaking, begin with the dark, and then the light follows. There's the evening and the morning, the first day. And so the dark part of the 14th day of the month is the first part of that day. It immediately follows, the sunset on the 13th, and then there's the 14th day at evening after sunset in the darkness. And so some people want to celebrate the Passover during that part of the 14th day of the month. But it's all out of whack, because you can't slaughter the Passover lamb between the evenings if you've already eaten it the dark part of the day before, the dark part of the night. You see what I'm saying? So the 14th, when it says on the evening of the 14th is when you're to eat the Passover, it's talking about the evening going down following the 14th day. Because now, between the going downs, you've slaughtered that animal, and presumably you begin to roast it, and then after nightfall, because it takes hours for that animal to cook and to roast. So in the dark part of the night, then the animal is eaten. And so the instruction here is important, that on that same night I will pass through Mitzrayim. And it was that night after the animals were slaughtered and then eaten that he passed through Mitzrayim. And it was the next morning when they left Egypt. It was the morning of the 15th day. And the morning of the 15th day is the day that's to be commemorated, as it is here in verse 14. This is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to Yahweh, a lasting ordinance. For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, remove the yeast from your houses. And whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the 7th must be cut off from Israel. Because the instruction is that we're to remember this night. We're to commemorate it for the generations to come. There's never going to come a point in time where we're to cease remembering this event. Every year on the anniversary of that event, we're to commemorate it by the lamb, the unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, and by keeping vigil. And we're going to get to that verse in a few minutes. Keeping vigil to honor the Father. So this is the day that we're to commemorate. It's the 15th day of the first month. The day following the night when the firstborn was slaughtered in all of Egypt. It says on the first day, hold a sacred assembly. and another one on the seventh day. Do no work at all on these days, except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do. And so on all of the other Sabbaths, in my understanding, no work is to be done, including preparation of food on the Sabbaths. And that's the reason why he gave the manna and gave the instruction in the wilderness about collecting the manna on the sixth day, so they wouldn't have to go out and gather on the seventh day. And on the sixth day, when they gathered that manna, they were to prepare it. And they were to eat whatever they needed that day, and the rest was saved for the seventh day, and then they were to eat that food that had already been prepared on the seventh day. However, on the first day and on the seventh day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you are allowed to prepare food. That's the only work you're allowed to do. And the reason for that is because the instruction was to roast the lamb and to eat it. And so as the evening turned into night, they were still cooking. They couldn't help it. They were still cooking that lamb. And so the Father gave this exception to the rule about cooking. He said, you may prepare food on the first and the seventh days of this festival, this pilgrimage festival of unleavened bread. So celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Mitzrayim. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. Again, repeating this important aspect of the day. It's that very day. And this expression, that very day, is an interesting one. It's used several times, especially in regard to fulfillment of prophecy. That it's on this very day that something occurred. Not some general or approximated day, but a specific day, an appointed day. And so it was on this very day that Father brought our ancestors out of Egypt, and that's the day that we're to commemorate by eating the unleavened bread. That and for 7 days. So the order, I think, makes better sense when we understand it this way, that on the 14th day, between the evenings, the animal was slaughtered, then it was roasted, and then it was eaten as the 14th day was turning into the 15th. The blood being on the doorposts, the death angel passed that night, during the dark part of the night, and in the morning the Israelites left Egypt. Pharaoh sent them out, he cast them out, he kicked them out of his land. And so that's the order of events, and so that's why we do it the way that we do it. Trying to avoid the confusion that comes with misunderstanding what the expression evening of the 14th day means. It doesn't mean that first part of the 14th day. It means the evening that follows the 14th day. So in the first month you are to eat bread made without yeast from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. And so here you have, again, you have 7 days that are being referred to here. The evening of the 14th is talking about the time when the 14th day is turning into the 15th day. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is supposed to be from the 15th through the 21st. So if you count, you got 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. 7 days unleavened bread was eaten. And so the expression here where it says from the evening of the 14th day, doesn't mean on the 14th day, but from that evening that follows the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. In other words, when the 21st day was coming to an end, turning into the 22nd. And I'm kind of being a little bit redundant and maybe simplistic, because I want everyone to see and to avoid the pitfalls of misunderstanding what's being said. Because there are many out there who do misunderstand and who are doing it at the wrong time because of their interpretation of the text. Okay, so for 7 days no yeast is to be found in your houses. Why is this important, that no yeast is to be found in your houses? Because we're commemorating something that happened, and he's instructed us to rehearse and reenact what Father did for our ancestors, so that we can understand that we are in the same body of those people who literally experienced the Passover that night. We're supposed to try to experience it as though we were there. And so we speak in terms of us being there that night when we rehearsed the Passover. Because we were there. We were in our ancestors. We hadn't yet been born, but we were still part of that body that experienced the Passover. And so we experience the Passover nowadays, and every time we do it and commemorate it, as though we were there. Remember those Walter Cronkite teaching videos about you? He did like American history and all these different figures in American history. And the title of that, little 10, 15-minute thing was, "You Are There." You all remember that from school? You don't remember that?
You're showing your age, buddy.
Yeah, I guess I'm showing my age.
I remember him saying that.
So he did these videos, putting us back in the days of our fathers and what they experienced during the Revolution and whatnot. But you were there, so we're like entering into the story ourselves. But that's really the idea of what the Passover is supposed to be for us. We're supposed to enter into that experience so that we can see the glorious actions of the Father in delivering His people, our ancestors, and us, because He delivered us out of Egypt too that night and that day. So for 7 days, no yeast is to be found in your houses, and whoever eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off from the community of Israel, whether he is alien or native born. And the reason for this is that we're supposed to be on board with what the Father is instructing us to do, so that we can get the full impact of the picture that He wants to bring to us as we celebrate on this anniversary date. Eat nothing made with yeast wherever you live. Wherever you live. And so this includes us. We're in the exile. And, we're living as further removed as you can be from the land of Israel, on the other side of the earth. But wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread. And so we're going to eat unleavened bread beginning next Friday evening as we celebrate and reenact this Passover. We're going to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. And I strongly encourage you and even urge you to do the unleavened bread thing, because this is all part of the experience. It's all part of knowing what the Father has for us. And there's also pictures and lessons in the unleavened bread, which we're going to look at probably next Sabbath, after the Passover. We're going to talk about a little bit more in detail about the unleavened bread and what it symbolizes and so forth. So it's important that we have this mindset that we're going to get rid of the leaven out of our houses so that we can experience what they experienced and eat the unleavened bread so that we can know what the Father had for them and what He has for us. Verses 21 through 22 tell us this. It says, Moshe summoned all the elders of Israel, and he said to them, "Go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Pesach lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and on both sides of the door frame. Not one of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning." And so this was a specific instruction for that one and only time, because subsequent Passovers, the people were all gathered together in the square, if you will, in the open space in front of the tabernacle or in front of the temple. And they were all celebrating as a nation. And they were all outside, and they didn't go back to their tents until morning because they were keeping vigil again. And so this one and only time, they were commanded to stay inside their houses and not go out. Because if they were to go outside of their house, they would be putting themselves in a place of being struck down by the death angel. So take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood. When one slaughters an animal, the most humane way is to slice it across its neck in a certain location where there's a large blood vessel, and it bleeds out quickly. and it's virtually painless. I've never been a lamb, so I don't know if it's completely painless for the lamb, but it's virtually painless, and they'll bleed out quickly and die. And so the blood is caught in a bucket or a basin, and then they were to take hyssop. Hyssop is just a plant, a leafy plant found in those, actually it's found all over the world, but they were to take the hyssop and dip it in the blood and then spatter it against the door frame of the house, spatter that blood. And so there were droplets of blood and pools of blood that were dripping down and that were flowing down on the doorposts. Again, a picture of the Messiah who was hung on the tree, and he was dripping blood and spattered with blood. And his blood was being spattered and dripped all over the place. So not one of you shall go out of the house until morning. All right. Continuing the instructions for the first Passover, when Yahweh goes through the land to strike down the Mitzrites, and here again, Yahweh himself is named as that one who would be the one that would strike down the firstborn. He will see the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe, and he will pass over that doorway. And he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. Again, this word lasting is le'olam. We've talked about that word before. It means unto the age. It has the idea of going out to a point in time that is undefined. And so lasting or everlasting is sometimes the way it's translated. It means on and without ceasing, without ending, that we're to obey these instructions. The word ordinance there is the Hebrew word huk, and we did that study on the Torah terminology. The huk comes from the idea of carving or cutting out, and I suspect the word huk was adopted from that idea of when the Father carved out the 10 words in the tablets of stone. I'm not sure really the history of the usage of this word, but the word huk does not only refer to the 10 words that were carved in stone, but there are a number of other huks or hukot in Hebrew that are instructions that are in some sense carved out, or in other words, they're permanent. When you carve out in stone, you make a permanent record of a thing. And so the huk is a permanent ordinance, if you will, a permanent instruction. And this instruction about the Passover is a huk, although you might think that it would be a mishpat, a judgment, or a decision. It's not, it's a huk. It's a permanent fixture, an instruction that we must always follow. So the Passover is that permanent instruction, and that's why the Messiah talked about remembering his death until he comes. Whenever we do this thing that we're going to talk about, the eating of the unleavened bread and the drinking of the wine, we're remembering his death until he comes. Because we're not to cease this memorial service that occurred on the anniversary of the death of the lamb back in Egypt and the death of the son of Elohim in his day. It's something that we're to regard as a lasting memorial and an ordinance for us. When you enter the land that Yahweh will give you as he promised, observe this ceremony. And when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? Then tell them it is the Pesach sacrifice to Yahweh who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Mitzrayim and spared our homes when he struck down the Mitzrites. And then jumping down to Exodus chapter 13, I wanted to throw this in here because it relates to the slide that we just looked at when you tell your son. It says, when he asks you, what does the ceremony mean to you? Then you tell him, the Father delivered us out of Egypt that night. And so in Exodus 13:8 it says, and you shall show your son in that day meaning the day of the commemoration, the day that we're remembering what happened, saying, this is done because of that which the Lord, Yahweh, did unto me when I came forth out of Egypt. So here's that idea of the next generation and many generations after relating to our sons that this is what was done unto me. It wasn't just the people that were there that day. Just as when Moshe describes the covenant that Father made with his people, he said this covenant is not just with you who are here today, but is with those who will come after you. And so the Passover we're to regard as something that we were there along with those people who literally experienced it. And so this is done because of what Yahweh did unto me when I came forth out of Egypt. Okay? The Hebrew word there, to show, I have it underlined, is the word nagad. It means to tell or announce or to report or to declare, make known, or expound, especially of something that was not understood or not known. And the reason I bring this out is because in a typical Jewish Seder, their celebration of this Passover event, they use a Haggadah. It's a booklet that contains the order of service, and that's what the word Seder means. It's the Seder, it's the order of events that they're to follow, the order of readings, the order of prayers, the order of serving the food, and what to serve and when. And so they've listed out this Haggadah is what every Jewish family takes with them to the Passover table, and usually the father will read from it. He'll go through all the verses and all the prayers and the scriptures and so forth. And this is the order of service, the Seder. So the Jewish Haggadah comes from this word nagad. It means to tell, announce, to declare, to make known, or to expound. In other words, the father is supposed to tell the story to his children, his sons and daughters. That's what the instruction's all about. Because if we don't tell our children what these things are all about, how are they going to know what it's all about? And how are they going to continue in the same faith walk that we're in? And so all throughout the Torah, we're instructed to teach our children and to tell them these things, including on the Passover. You're to show your son and daughter in that day, on that memorial service, why it is that we serve Yahweh, because it was with a mighty hand that he delivered me out of Egypt. Hallelujah. So we don't need a book to take with us next Friday. We're just going to tell the story. We're going to tell the story about what happened, and it's going to be ad-libbed a little bit. Some of it's going to be planned, some of it ad-libbed. And we're just going to go through what happened in Egypt. We're going to remember the great deliverance of the Father. So further instructions for the first Passover. This again, still we're on the first Passover. We're going to spend far less time on the subsequent Passovers. But I wanted to go through these instructions to lay out a foundation of how the Father wanted his people then and how he wants us now to observe this memorial service. The sons of Israel did just what Yahweh commanded Moshe and Aaron. At midnight, Yahweh struck down all the firstborn in Mitzrayim, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner, who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Mitzrayites got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Mitzrayim, and there was not a house without someone dead. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moshe and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the sons of Israel. Go, worship Yahweh as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go and also bless me." And the Mitzrayites urged the people to hurry and leave the country. They didn't want any more plagues. Enough is enough. All of their livelihood was basically destroyed. Their fields, their crops, their animals. I mean, just everything. And now their firstborn sons and the Egyptians didn't want anything to do any longer with the sons of Israel, and they urged them to go, and they were willing to give them gold and silver and clothing and jewelry just to get them out. Here, take this stuff and get out. We don't want you here anymore. For otherwise, they said, we will all die. And so the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. The sons of Israel did as Moshe instructed and asked the Mitzrites for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. And Yahweh had made the Mitzrites favorably disposed toward the people. And they gave them what they asked for. And so they plundered the Mitzrites. They took all their wealth. The sons of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot. There was about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, as well as large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. So the livestock of the Mitzrites was destroyed in the fields. Those who were not put up into the barns for protection. Much of their livestock and nearly all of their crops were destroyed. But we also know that most of the plagues did not occur in the land of Goshen where the Israelites were. The Father protected the Israelites. And so they had large droves of livestock to take with them as they exited Egypt. And so they took them with them, all of their possessions, all of the plunder from the Egyptians, all of their own accumulations, as well as livestock, presumably even foodstuffs, they took with them. So it says, with the dough that they had brought from Mitzrayim, they baked cakes of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Mitzrayim and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. So here, where it says earlier that Moses said, go, get out, it says here they were driven out. In other words, Pharaoh was just like anxious, basically booting them out of the land. You're not welcome here anymore. Get out now. And so that morning they left Egypt. They didn't waste any time in going. And so that's why they ate unleavened bread, is because they didn't have time. They were packing their stuff and getting out of there as quick as possible. Hallelujah. And so we commemorate that by eating the unleavened bread. And then finally, well, not finally, but the next verse tells us something very interesting. It says, the length of time the sons of Israel lived in Mitzrayim was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, and here's that expression again, to the self-same day, some translations put it, the very same day, all Yahweh's divisions left Mitzrayim. And so this 15th day of the first month was the day of deliverance. They got out from under the clutches and under the power of Pharaoh, and he gladly kicked them out. And this was a day of freedom for the sons of Israel, as it is for us when we receive Messiah and recognize his redemptive act that he performed on the tree. It's a day of freedom. It sets us free, not just from sin, although that's very important, but it sets us free from all the other stuff, religious practices. And I guess we'll go through that again, like I said, when we do a little bit further study on unleavened bread. But he delivers us and he sets us free, not from his law, but from the things that kept us in bondage.
Amen.
That's what the freedom's all about. Freedom to obey the Father wholly and wholeheartedly, and to please the Father in every way. We're no longer under the oppressive instructions of the world or of other religious systems that claim to know God, but we're free from all of the nonsense of the religious world. We're free to do as the Father pleases us to do. Hallelujah. And so this is a day of freedom. This 15th day of the first month is a celebration of our freedom. In Genesis 15, the 430 years it's spoken of in the book of Acts, it's actually referenced in Genesis 15 in a little bit different way. And I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail, but just to mention it here, because it takes, I think if we're going to work through this timeline of 430 years and 400 years, we're going to have to go into some more detail and look at some genealogies and look at some other important information. But in summary of this 430 years, when Father made this covenant to Abram in Genesis 15, the covenant is stated as follows. On that day Yahweh made a covenant with Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land, from the river of Mitzrayim to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites." And so this covenant was the promise that Father had made to Abraham about his seed. That Abraham's seed would inherit this land along with Abram. And so all of this land was going to be given to this seed. All of the land that Abraham had walked out in his days. He was told to walk all about that land, north, south, east, and west, and everywhere your foot touches, I will give you that land, was the promise. So this covenant that Father made with Abram was about the land. It says, "Then Yahweh said to him, know for certain," this is the enacting of the covenant and the sacrifice of the covenant. Yahweh said to him, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." So a couple of things I want to look at just briefly here is that this prediction, this prophesying about the Israelites going down into a country not their own was obviously about Egypt. They were enslaved and mistreated. There was a period of 400 years that is talked about. And then Yahweh said he would punish the nation and that they would come out with great possessions. And we just read all of that in Exodus chapter 12, that all of those things happened. The sons of Israel came out of Egypt. They were set free from slavery, and they came out with great possessions. And in the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here. So these 4th generations, trying to reconcile, and again, I'm not going to do a very detailed job of it at all today. The 400 years, the 4th generation, how does that all come together? What are the 4 generations and the 4th generation? Well, the 4th generation has to be the generation of Moshe, right? He's the one that led the people out of Egypt and fulfilled this prophecy of being set free and taking great possessions with them. So Moshe was the 4th generation. What were the first 3 generations? And we're given that information in Exodus chapter 6. And I'm skipping some verses through here, but I'm going to read the main genealogical points here to lay out these 4 generations that are referred to in the prophecy. These are the names of the sons of Levi, according to their records. Levi is the 1st generation, because Levi and his brothers were that 1st generation that went down into Egypt along with their father Jacob because of Joseph. You know the whole story. But Levi was that 1st generation of people that were in Egypt. It says that these were the sons of Levi: Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And I underlined Kohath because these 3 sons are the 2nd generation, but Kohath is interesting to me because we're going to follow Kohath's line in the genealogy. The sons of Kohath in verse 18 says were Amram, Izhar, Hebron, and Uzziel. Kohath lived 133 years. So the third generation, Levi, Kohath, and his son Amram. Amram was the third generation. And then it says in verse 20, Amram married his father's sister, Jochebed, who bore him Aharon and Moshe, and there's the fourth generation. Amram lived 137 years. It was this same Aharon and Moshe to whom Yahweh said, bring the sons of Israel out of Mitzrayim by their divisions. They were the ones who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Mitzrayim, about bringing the sons of Israel out of Mitzrayim. It was the same Moshe and Aharon. So there's a great emphasis that this is the Moshe being spoken of here in this story, that Moshe is the one. Moshe and his brother Aharon were the ones who led Israel out of Egypt. And so these are the four generations being referred to in the promise. Let me go back real quick about the promise from Genesis chapter 15 in verse 16. It says, in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. And so the fourth generation, from the time they went down into Egypt, Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Moshe, the fourth generation. And that's how the prophecy is fulfilled. In the 80th year of Moshe's life, he delivered the Israelites out of Egypt. And so there's still a little bit more working through the genealogies and the timeline and the dates and so forth that have to be done, but I don't want to do that today. I just want to point out that the fourth generation begins with Levi, who went down to Egypt, and ends the fourth generation with Moshe, who came out of Egypt and back to the land of promise. Instructions for the first Passover. Getting back to Exodus chapter 12 and verse 42. Now here's the part about keeping vigil that is commanded for the Passover. That night, the night of remembering what happened. It says, because Yahweh kept vigil. And keeping vigil means staying up all night. It just means staying awake. When you're kids, you like to do that. You like to, I don't know, we did when we were kids. We'd watch movies as late into the night as we could until we just, dropped off and couldn't help ourselves. But because Yahweh kept vigil that night to bring them out of Mitzrayim, on this night, all the sons of Israel are to keep vigil to honor Yahweh for the generations to come. And so this is one of those little-known instructions about the Passover. It isn't talked about much, and it isn't really even practiced much. But this is something the Father wants those of us who are remembering this night. We're supposed to do this. I don't know how up you are for it, pardon the pun, to keep vigil throughout the night. But that's something we're going to try to do. I don't think we're going to stay in this building all night. But hopefully we'll make some sort of effort when we go back to our homes next Friday night to try to keep vigil, to honor Yahweh, who kept vigil for us because we were delivered out of Egypt, right? We were there. And so he did that for us, so we're going to honor him by returning the favor, as it were, to honor him. Keep vigil throughout the night. Yahweh said to Moshe and Aharon, these are the regulations. So just a couple more verses about the regulations of the Passover, and then we're going to move on. These are the regulations, or hukah, again, it's the word hukah, regulations, carved in stone type of instructions for the Pesach. No foreigner is to eat of it. No foreigner is to eat of it. This was for the sons of Israel only. And I think this is where some Christian churches have their closed communions, where members only are allowed to come, but non-members aren't supposed to. It's this idea that this particular ceremony, this particular remembrance, is for the sons of Israel only. Outsiders aren't supposed to partake of it. It would be like bringing the Egyptians who refused to put the blood on their doorposts. Yeah, come on into our house, we'll save you. It wasn't about that. It was about whether people are going to obey the Father or not. And we're not the one that provide redemption for others. It's the Father that provides redemption. And so no foreigner is to eat of it, meaning only the obedient ones are to partake of this Passover ceremony. Any slave that you have bought may eat of it after you have circumcised him, but a temporary resident and a hired worker may not eat of it, because they're not part of Israel. They're not obeying the commandments of Israel. They're not in covenant relationship with the Father. And so they're not allowed to participate. And it seems that we're not supposed to have them along. The Passover is a very special night. It's sacred. It has special meaning for us. And I guess in some sense it would be like casting your pearls before the swine. If we invited unbelievers into this ceremony and to celebrate it with us, it'd be like they wouldn't have any sense of the importance of it. And it would be, our efforts would be wasted on them because they wouldn't understand it. Probably get some questions and comments on that comment that I just made, and that's okay. You can grill me on that. That's the way I'm seeing it. That's the way I understand it. Why would he give this instruction that the foreigner's not to eat of it if it wasn't something special for the sons of Israel only? Okay, moving on. It must be eaten inside one house or one dwelling place. Take none of the meat outside the house. And this was for the first Passover. This instruction was for the first Passover. Do not break any of the bones. That was for all the Passover lambs throughout the generations, because it was a picture of Messiah whose bones were not broken. None of his bones were broken. The whole community of Israel must celebrate it. It's a requirement for the sons of Israel to celebrate it. Otherwise, they're not participating and partaking of that covenant relationship that the Father offers us. An alien living among you who wants to celebrate Yahweh's Pesach must have all the males in his household circumcised, and then he may take part as one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat of it. Circumcision was another one of those covenants that were made originally with Abraham, but all the sons of Israel who followed in the faith of Abraham were circumcised. This was a sign of covenant relationship between the Father and his people, and therefore those who were going to or desired to partake in the Pesach had to be circumcised as a sign of their covenant relationship with the Father. The same law applies to the native born and to the alien living among you. So all the sons of Israel did just what Yahweh had commanded Moshe and Aaron, and on that very day, there's that expression again, on that self-same day, the very same day, Yahweh brought the sons of Israel out of Mitzrayim by their divisions. And so those are the instructions for the Pesach, and we're instructed to follow those particular items as well, up to the point where we're not able to. I mean, if there are instructions that we can't do, like there's no point, nor was there any history, like I said, of the Israelites who celebrated in the presence of the Father, where they would sprinkle blood on their doorposts. It just wasn't needed anymore because the death angel was a one-time event, and that's when it was done. And so there are certain instructions, and you can ask me about individual instructions, and we'll try to go through them as you are interested in doing so. But we follow the instructions as closely as possible so that we can have a genuine reenactment and experience as though we were because we were in Egypt. We were, right? Hallelujah. The second Passover was celebrated in the second year after they came out of Egypt, as it's related to us in Numbers chapter 9. Yahweh spoke to Moshe in the desert of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they came out of Mitzrayim. And he said, have the sons of Israel celebrate the Pesach at the appointed time, celebrated at the appointed time at twilight or between the evenings on the 14th day of the month. in accordance with all its rules and regulations. And that's where I get this idea of we want to follow it as closely as possible to all the instructions that we're given. The rules are the hukah, the hukot, and the regulations are the mishpatim. So there are laws and right rulings for the Passover. And so Moshe told the sons of Israel to celebrate the Pesach, and they did so in the desert of Sinai at twilight, or between the evenings, on the 14th day of the first month. The sons of Israel did everything just as Yahweh commanded Moshe. And so here's the second keeping of the Passover, and they did it as close to the vest as possible, and as closely as was needed to the way it was done that first year. Instructions for subsequent Passovers, and this is found in Deuteronomy 16. We're only going to look at this Deuteronomy 16 passage, about 6 or 7 verses. And here's what it says, because this instruction was given to the sons of Israel as they were preparing to enter into the promised land after the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And by the way, that second Passover, in the second year after they came out of Egypt, was the last time they had celebrated the Passover. It was never celebrated while they were wandering in the wilderness. It wasn't celebrated again until they had crossed the Jordan, the Yarden, and were getting ready to invade Jericho. And we'll read about that, I think, briefly here too. So it says, observe the month of the Aviv and celebrate the Pesach of Yahweh your Elohim, because in the month of the Aviv he brought you out of Mitzrayim by night. Sacrifice as the Pesach to Yahweh your Elohim an animal from your flock or herd at the place Yahweh will choose as a dwelling for his name. And so this is for all the rest of the Passovers. They weren't to celebrate it in their individual homes anymore. They were to celebrate it in the place of Yahweh's presence. Do not eat it with bread made with yeast, but for 7 days eat unleavened bread, the bread of affliction. And evidently, unleavened bread is to be a picture of affliction. Again, we're going to talk about that next Sabbath. Because you left Mitzrayim in haste, so that all the days of your life you may remember the time of your departure from Mitzrayim. And the other important aspect of that is that you're to pass that information down to your children by reenacting it and rehearsing it on the anniversary every year. Let no yeast be found in your possession in all your land for 7 days. Do not let any of the meat you sacrifice on the evening of the first day remain until morning. So some of those instructions remain. But the difference here is that it's to be kept in the presence of Yahweh and no longer in individual homes. You must not, and here more specifically tells us that, you must not sacrifice the Pesach in any town Yahweh your Elohim gives you, except in the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name. There you must sacrifice the Pesach in the evening, or between the evenings, the Hebrew reads, when the sun goes down on the anniversary of your departure from Mitzrayim. Roast it and eat it at the place Yahweh your Elohim will choose, and then in the morning return to your tents. So here again is how it was different. It was to be celebrated out in the open with all the rest of the Israelites. They were to keep vigil that night, and then in the morning they could return to their tents and maybe catch up with a nap or whatever they needed. But that was the instruction given. On the evening of the 14th, this is the third Passover, and this is found in the book of Joshua, chapter 5. It says, on the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal, on the plains of Jericho, the sons of Israel celebrated the Passover, the Pesach. And by the way, the verses that precede this tell us that the sons of Israel weren't circumcised in all of those years they were out in the wilderness. So Joshua had them circumcised, and before they were going to enter into combat, because they needed to be in covenant, in proper relationship with the Father, in order for the Father's favor to fall upon them. So after that circumcision, it says on the evening of the 14th day they celebrated the Pesach, the day after the Pesach, that very day they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. And then it tells us that the manna ceased that very day. They had eaten the manna throughout those 40 years, but after they entered into the land and they celebrated the Pesach and they ate of the produce of the land, that the manna ceased. Now, Messiah's Passover. And we're going to end our study by covering about 8 slides or so about what we need to understand about the Messiah's Passover. And so here's the question that has been posed, because there's confusion astir in the 4 Gospels about what the Messiah actually did on the night that he was betrayed. Did the Messiah, Yahushua, Messiah Jesus, eat the Passover with his disciples on the night he was betrayed? Or did Messiah become the Passover lamb as he was impaled on the tree? Which of those two seems more necessary? That Messiah eat the Passover, or the Messiah become the Passover and fulfill the Passover as the Lamb of Elohim who takes away the sin of the world? If you subscribe to the first view, which I did for many years, that he ate the Passover with his disciples, you get a great deal of support, or it seems like you're getting a great deal of support from Matthew, Mark, and Luke on this view. And I'll just read the Matthew account, these few verses. It says in Matthew 26, on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Yahushua and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Pesach?" And he replied, "Go into the city to a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I am going to celebrate the Pesach with my disciples at your house." And so the disciples did as Yahushua had directed them and prepared the Pesach. And when evening came, Yahushua was reclining at the table with the 12. So the way it's always been taught us, and the way it seems from these first 3 Gospels, it's like indisputable, nearly indisputable, that the Messiah ate the Passover with his disciples, because that's the way the narrative reads, is that he sent them out, they prepared the Passover, and then that evening they sat down and ate a meal together. And so is that in fact what happened? And this kind of gets sticky, it kind of gets difficult, because there's an apparent contradiction in the 4th Gospel. The 4th Gospel, known as John's Gospel, reads a little bit differently. It says this in chapter 18, verse 28. It says regarding the trial and the execution of the Master, it says this: the Yehudim, the Jews, led Yahushua from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor, and by now it was early morning. So this is the morning after he was betrayed, after the dinner. And to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Yehudim did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Pesach. And so here in this account it tells that the Jews refused to go into the palace because they had not eaten the Pesach yet. Pesach for them was coming that evening, because that was the 14th day of the month. And so now you have this contradiction, this apparent contradiction. And so how to resolve this? The first 3 Gospels tell us that he ate the Passover with his disciples. The 4th Gospel tells us that the Passover was not yet eaten, implying the fulfillment of those things which were suggested earlier. First of all, by Yochanan the Immerser, John the Immerser. Behold, the Lamb of Elohim who takes away the sin of the world. And Paul says that Jesus, Yahushua, is our Passover lamb, right? And so he couldn't do both, because the Passover couldn't be done on 2 successive nights. It was a one-time event during the year. It was on the anniversary, right? So did he eat it with his disciples, or did he become it and fulfill prophecy in Scripture? Well, he had. I think the answer is obvious, which leaves a big, wide open gap of a problem with the first three Gospels, that he had to become the Passover. He fulfilled the prophecy of the Passover, and he did so on the anniversary of that date. And so, as he hung on the tree and died between the evenings, by the way, he did die between the evenings, just as the instructions of the Passover are given to us. It is between the evenings that this animal is slaughtered, and then you can begin to roast it. Messiah was slaughtered on the tree between the evenings, and he died between the evenings, and he became our Passover lamb. And that's the whole basis of our salvation, is that he was our Passover lamb. So it had to be, not that he ate the Passover, but that he was the Passover. And so the problem with the Gospels is a very difficult one to try to reconcile. A couple of ideas. I don't have nearly all the answers that I could hope to give to you to resolve this problem. But there, a couple of reasons could come into play as to this misunderstanding about what happened. Number one, there could have been a misunderstanding by the Greek language translators about what happened. Because the Gospels were written in the original tongue, and at some point in time were translated into Greek. And that's a whole nother study that we don't have time to get into. But the Greek language is a problem here, because in the translation, and you can see indications throughout the Gospels that those Gospels were translated from an original Hebrew-based language. Things like, which rabbi, which translated means teacher. You find that in the fourth Gospel. And there are other expressions, similar expressions, which are indicating that the Greek translator is trying to help us to understand what the Hebrew term means, because it was written originally in Hebrew and translated into Greek. So there could have been misunderstandings by the Greek translators, a misunderstanding of the events that occurred, maybe even an attempt to make sense of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, where he lays out for us that the Master instructed us to that he would no longer eat this with us until he eats it anew with us in the kingdom. And the reference there is to the Passover. So there are these are just a couple of quick suggestions about how to reconcile. Frankly, I can't do that. I am not prepared. I don't have the information available to reconcile these accounts, except to say that the fourth Gospel must certainly be the more genuine, the more accurate rendition and account of what actually happened, because he had to become the Passover lamb for us. So another suggestion was that on the dinner the night before, on the night that he was betrayed, he was rehearsing the Passover and giving instructions to his disciples, some of which come forward in the sense of, he was doing it. He was doing the Pesach with his disciples. But that was another suggestion, that he was just rehearsing the Passover with his disciples and trying to give his disciples understanding about the meaning of the Passover with him in view, as him fulfilling the Passover. And so that is also a possibility, but again, wow. Maybe some manuscripts will come forward someday that were originally written in Hebrew that maybe will shed some light on how the Greek language came to read the way it does today, and why many believers believe that he ate the Passover with his disciples. Again, he's the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world, and so he must, this is the bottom line, he must have become the Passover, and therefore did not eat the true Passover at its appointed time with his disciples. At least not that year. He may have done so the year before, but that year, that dinner was not the Passover dinner that he ate with his disciples. And finally, this is my final slide, from Matthew chapter 26. It says, while they were eating, again referring to this dinner that they had on the night that he was betrayed, Yahushua took bread, he gave thanks and broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat, this is my body. So this is why I'm suggesting that maybe he was rehearsing with his disciples the true meaning of the Passover with his disciples. And then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. And so it may have been that he was just rehearsing with his disciples and giving them insight into the true meaning of the Passover. So how then are we to celebrate the Passover? And this is in summary of what we've covered so far today. Well, we're going to remember the redemption out of Egypt. We're going to remember the mighty acts and powerful working of Yahweh's right arm to bring about plagues, to bring judgment on the Egyptian gods, to bring deliverance for his people out of Egypt. And then we're going to look at what the Messiah did to accomplish the more permanent redemptive act for his people, for us. And this he only had to do once. And so we're not going to be slaughtering a lamb according to the instructions. Like on the 14th day, select the lamb. On the 10th day, select the lamb. On the 14th day, slaughter it, and then roast it and eat it that evening. We're not going to precisely follow that. I hesitate, I'm a little bit reluctant, but I also understand that Messiah is our Passover, and he only died once. And so I'm not sure how fitting it would be. We don't have very clear instruction at all about how to carry forward with celebrating and remembering the Passover. So we're going to have lamb. It's not going to be slaughtered according to the instructions, but we're going to remember the Messiah. We're going to eat the unleavened bread and drink the wine. And we're going to remember that those things are a representation of his body and his blood that he shed to enact the new covenant on our behalf. So that's how we're going to do it. We're going to retell the story. And that's what it's all about. It's remembering and then passing on this tradition, this good biblical tradition, and this information about the redemption to our children so that they can rehearse it with us while they're growing up in our households. And so that when they're adults, they can take up the mantle and continue following these instructions of the Father. And when they have children, little ones, young ladies and young men, when you have children someday, you're going to be teaching them about the Passover and how Yahweh delivered you and you and you out of Egypt. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
So what say you?